Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Cameron English, Director of Biosciences at the American Council on Science and Health with you as always. Joined again by Dr. Chuck Dinerstein, our Director of Medicine. Chuck, how are things?
Good. Well, yes, good. Things are good.
I think everyone can always elaborate on that answer when someone says, hey, how are you? And you go, I'm good. Anyways, so we'll leave it at that. We're both doing pretty well today. We have 3 stories to discuss this time instead of 2. So we got a little bit of a buy 2, get 1 free situation going on here. Chuck almost died last week. So we're gonna discuss what that was like and maybe some of the implications for the rest of us, perhaps if we're in a similar situation. And then we're going to talk about unregulated algorithms in healthcare and how that actually can affect how you're treated in a hospital, for example. And then we're going to wrap up talking about the Cleveland Clinic publishing a very terrible article about vaping. I just don't know what to say about it. Actually, I have plenty to say about it, but we'll get to that later, Chuck. So I don't even know what to say here. So you almost died last week. Just take us from there.
Okay. Well, so I underwent a surgical procedure, and then 3 days post-operatively, having dodged COVID for 2 years, I got COVID. And about 4 days after that, I threw a clot from my leg and abdomen into my lung, a pulmonary embolism. But it was a fairly rare version of a pulmonary embolism. It's called a saddle embolus. If you go look at the article, you can see a picture of the clot because you know how guys like to brag about how big things are. But this is a pretty significant size clot. It covered up a great deal of the outflow of blood from the right side of my heart into my lung. And it was very kind of a strange experience. We were taking the dogs out for the evening before we all got ready to go to bed. And I said, I just feel funny. And I walked up 2 or 3 steps and I said to myself, why am I so short of breath walking up 2 or 3 steps? And that was the last thing I remember for about what my wife tells me was 5 minutes when I awoke to find I was laying on the deck with my wife over me and EMTs rushing in. And what she tells me is I just stopped breathing. Luckily, she was a trained nurse, so she gave me a few breaths, made some calls, and they got me going again. Saddle emboli are fairly uncommon to see in the hospital. Only about 2 to 5% of patients with a pulmonary embolism come in with a saddle embolus. And the reason for that is most people with a saddle embolus die in the field and are not diagnosed. And that's part of what I personally have a problem wrapping my head around, because if this had happened an hour later when I was sleeping, my wife would have found me dead in bed in the morning. It just would have been nobody to notice things had gone sadly awry. So that was my near-death experience, and there's a certain irony in it because I'm a vascular surgeon, so I'm well acquainted with pulmonary emboli. I'm well acquainted with people that have had a saddle embolus. So I never thought I was going to be the one to be on the other side of the desk, so to speak, with that. I was rummaging around to try and find some science in there. I did note one thing. Rudolf Virchow in the mid-1800s described the 3 necessary components for the formation of a blood clot: an injury to the vein, which was part and parcel of any kind of surgical procedure, hypercoagulable blood, meaning blood that's more likely to clot, which is a known side effect of COVID, and relatively slow flow in the veins, which is something that accompanies people that sit around in bed and sit around in the chairs after surgery and are more sedentary than they might usually be. So having all 3, it meant that I could craft any narrative I wanted to describe what had happened simply based on which one of those 3 factors, which are necessary but not by themselves sufficient, I wanted to stress. It could have been the surgery. It certainly could have been the COVID, or it could have been the laziness of the patient not choosing to move around as much as he should. And I think that was an important point for us all to consider, that when we look at the narrative, the discussion of science-based articles, it's rarely that we have a big fight about the facts per se. It's about how those facts are connected, how we connect the dots. And I think this was a good example of being able to connect the dots in any way you wanted. I also found that it's been increasingly difficult to kind of wrap my head around what happened, other than thinking of myself as one lucky person and having made a great choice in terms of a wife that was a nurse when we were dating. Because some of the other people I dated would not have known what to do. So, it's made me think about these experiences, these near-death experiences, a lot more. And while I didn't see the tunnel and I didn't hear harps playing, though some people would argue I'm never going to hear harps playing, hear the sound of flames. I think that what was important was how much more sharply focused my attention came to what really mattered in my life, especially as we continue through the busy voting and what will obviously be the post-voting season. I found that the most important things for me were kith and kin, no surprise there. And that the daily news, despite the way they frame it, was really relatively unimportant to me. So I've tried every night before I go to bed to think of things that I'm grateful for, but now I have something that I can think of every day. It's given me I don't know if a new lease on life, but it's certainly given me a perspective and urged me to get my act together a little bit more in terms of what I do.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to dive into that you just said there, but I remember after, I've never had a near-death experience like you had, but I remember after I got married and my wife and I moved into our first apartment together and we're starting to build a life together. I don't know why, but I just started thinking about dying a lot. Not in a morbid way, but like it was like, man, this could just be over in a minute. Someone could just run through an intersection and, crush me in my car. And that's all there is, And I remember starting to think about, wow, there's a lot about this life to really value, despite all of the politicking and the bills and, the hot weather, all the stuff that annoys me. It's interesting to put things in perspective like that. One thing I will say though is, I think you should keep to yourself that you just seemingly fell asleep for 5 minutes, because you could get a great book deal. It could be called like Heaven is an Ocean, and you could just tell this terrific story about, you swam, into the next life, and you did bestseller, man.
I see that. But back to your point about the idea of the light just going out. And that's really what my experience has been. I think a lot of people, if they think about dying at all, think about these times when you're surrounded by your family and in your bedroom, and you have time to say this or time to say that. But what was made eminently clear to me was that it can disappear in a moment, and that really gives you pause. I very much agree with what you would thought. It woke me up to some things that I should be doing differently. That's all I'll say on that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we don't have to dwell on it too much, but you did make an interesting observation about, it was your personal habits contributed to it. Of course, you had the surgery, and then there was COVID. So depending on what sort of virtue signaling you wanted to engage in, and you're not that sort, don't get me wrong, but if you wanted to, you could have said, that's why you need to wear a mask, because you could have, you could have ended my life, and that's why exercise is important, because I thought that was interesting. So if it's not us arguing over the facts, it's just more about the framing that we approach the facts with.
I think that's it more and more often as I look at stuff. We're not fighting so much about the facts. We're fighting about how we put those facts together.
Right. So I guess what my question is, how do we get people, or can we get people to do that more honestly? Because what I see, and again, I'm not exempt from this, being a flawed human like everybody else, it's very easy to look at data and go, well, it's more subtle than this, but in so many thoughts you say, well, I already think this conclusion, so how do I piece these together in such a way? That's a very strong temptation for everybody. And I see it even in people who have made their careers about promoting scientific thinking. They do the same thing. So is there a way to train people, or to train ourselves not to do that?
That's tough. Because I think part of it is subconscious. I don't even think we go, how can I put the story together? I think we look at the story and unconsciously build it into what we've already believed. So I think that we should be humble about the certainty of our views, and there's nothing wrong with looking at the alternative argument made by the opposition, whatever that might be, and trying to see its strengths. There's a lot to be gained when I pass an article over to someone that feels quite differently about it, because they come back with their own strong feelings and show me where the weaknesses are in my argument. And I think that that's part of what we should do. So to summarize, be a little bit less certain about the strength of our opinion, and at the same time be a little bit more open to seeing the correct portions of our opponent's thoughts.
Very good. Yeah. I think that's the old John Stuart Mill thing, right? Like, well, you bring your opinion, I'll bring my opinion, and we'll have ourselves a little picnic, and we'll argue over the facts, and then we'll straighten it out. Something like that. I guess that is really the best way to do it, is just to say we're all subject to this bias. And so let's acknowledge it, and then let's talk, instead of, fighting with each other until one of us is dead. I think that's
find the commonality and build from there.
There you go. Chuck knows what's up. Okay, so let's move on to this next story that you wrote. And I really enjoyed reading this. And I didn't think I would enjoy reading an article about algorithms in healthcare. But
how could you not? It's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and here's why, is because when people think of how the FDA approves drugs and medical devices, there seems to be two extremes, right? On the one hand, there's the people who think the FDA is in league with the devil, and they approve drugs because they want to kill people, or they deny drugs because they want to kill people, because, they're evil. They just have to be bad. And then on the other hand, you have the people who see any kind of federal bureaucracy as sort of like a protectors of the public. They don't have biases, and they just look at the data, and they hold everybody honest. All hail our Food and Drug Administration. But I think when I read your story, it's somewhere between those two extremes on the spectrum. There's some good, there's some bad, and there's a little, I don't know how to put it. It's a little less regulated, if you will, than we like to pretend, right? It's not that intentional, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So
healthcare algorithms are completely unregulated.
Right. So that would be one example. So talk about that a little bit.
Okay. So Epic has developed a electronic health record that is used by the majority of physicians and health systems in the country. They really have a lock on it. And they have access to all of the hospital data. So they're doing a big data ploy by saying, if we take all the data and we're looking for a particular problem, can we come up with an algorithm that will surveil in real time information being put into the system by the physicians and by the nursing staff and identify problems? And the problem that they looked at was sepsis, which is a significant medical problem that oftentimes develops after you come into the hospital rather than being the cause of your admission. And sepsis refers to any kind of overwhelming infection, bacterial or viral or even fungal, that causes you to have significant cardiovascular instability. You lose your blood pressure, you lose your ability to oxygenate, and in many cases die. When we think about all those old cases back earlier on of COVID working its way through the nursing homes and all the people on ventilators, that's an example of sepsis of a viral cause. So there's a clear need for identifying these patients early, and Epic has the data, it has the money, it has the data scientists to try and to develop an algorithm. So they went ahead and developed the algorithms, which they would then sell to the hospital systems as an add-on to the systems that they already bought. But in independent studies of how well the algorithm worked, they didn't work very well. Now, most artificial intelligence systems take a set of data which they use to train it, and it develops an algorithm that will identify, in this case, people with sepsis. The problem is that these training sets can be very brittle, and they're not easily transported from one hospital setting to another. So what they found with the algorithm is that it missed 2/3 of the patients that the clinical staff identified as having sepsis. And while it did identify maybe 8% of patients that were missed by clinicians, it had a huge had a high false positive rate, so that doctors were spending a lot of time following up on alarms that were of no importance. So overall, the algorithm was a failure, even though Epic had their own internal data that showed that it worked pretty well. Now, the FDA is now moving into the area of regulating software. For instance, the detection of atrial fibrillation on an Apple Watch is something that the FDA has approved of. The Apple Watch is, in that sense, a device. And they've come to the conclusion now that these algorithms developed by Epic as well as other companies are, in fact, medical devices because they're used to predict problems. Problem is that they're making absolutely no effort at all to find that these devices or these algorithms actually work and that they should be used in the field. So they're allowing corporate AI to really run amok in the healthcare system. And this is just the tip of the iceberg that is seen by the mass media. There are many instances, and I remember from being on the team that brought one of these electronic health records to our hospital, of problems in the system, and the corporations allow the user groups to try and fix it, but they don't provide any real support for fixing problems that are identified by all the hospitals.
All right. So there's so much here, Chuck, that I it's a little bit mind-boggling, to be honest. So the first thing is that, speaking, about the way the FDA is handling this, they've done this with a lot of areas that they have regulatory authority over, and I believe it's called regulatory discretion or something like that. But basically, even if they have authority over a product or some kind of a medical procedure or whatever, or drug, they can say, we are able to regulate this, but at this time we're not going to do anything about it. And that's basically what they said here. So it's fine.
Right. It's not even basically what they say. It's what they actually say, because they came out with this long guidance about what are medical devices to separate out some of these algorithms. The sepsis algorithm was considered a device because it was used for predictions of things. The algorithm that lies behind a pulse oximeter is not, because it doesn't predict. It just displays of value. But then they write, the FDA does not intend at this time to enforce compliance with applicable device requirements. So what is the value if they're not going to enforce compliance? Part of the problem is that they don't know how to enforce compliance, because this is not a drug that can go through testing. This is not a surgical medical device that can be implanted and you can look at outcomes. These are algorithms being used by a number of sites, and basically only the interested academics are taking a look. In the study that I looked at and pulled the information from was probably the first time that anybody attempted to validate one of these predictive algorithms. So it's a new area for the FDA to get into, and they have really fallen down on the job from my point of view. I mean, and the other analogy that I would make for it is that this is not a surprise from a bureaucratic point of view, because when you think about the 737 MAX systems, they upgraded their software and nobody looked at it. It wasn't tested. It was released on the say-so of Boeing and wound up killing 300 people.
Okay, so I'm not sure how to approach this, but are hospitals required to use this technology, or do they just do it because they assume it's going to help them, or is there some incentive to use it even if they don't know whether
there's no requirement to use it.
Okay.
They use it because they believe at the administrative level that it will be a time savings for the staff, that it will enhance patient safety. But they don't do the necessary tests to prove that it works. Now, part of the marketing of this is that Epic will turn around to some of its larger customers and say, you know what? We'll give this to you for free and let you use it. Because then they can turn around and say, this hospital system is using our sepsis algorithm. Would you be interested in purchasing it? So there's a lot of strange stuff going on.
Okay, so has the FDA reviewed it and said, okay, this is good to go, or have they just not even reviewed it yet?
No, they have not even reviewed it.
Okay.
The point we are at is the FDA has now identified software that falls within their purview to evaluate and approve. They have said clearly that they're not going to enforce compliance because even though they've identified the software, they don't have the expertise to know how to actually do that yet.
Man, all right. Excuse me.
And it's out there. That's why it's like that 737 MAX. They just said, okay, looks good to us, and out it went.
Yeah. It's really unbelievable. I'm trying to think of like what a solution to this would look like. And one thing that seems, I don't know how practical it is, but one thing that may work is if we didn't have just an FDA, but we had FDA, but then we had other institutions with similar expertise who could look at something like this and go, okay, this is going to work under these conditions. It's not going to work. And we recommend based on our review of it that you use this or you don't use this. But of course, as you just pointed out, right, this is the FDA's domain. And there's the way our system is set up, there isn't like an underwriter's laboratories that can tell you, okay, this device is safe to use in your kid's bedroom or whatever, No. So what would a solution look like? That's all I'm getting at.
I think the solution is that you need to have external validation of these systems. The academics do it. You could certainly get the FDA to collect the same type of data that the academicians did, which was to go through the records and identify all the cases that were pulled by the algorithm and compare it to the actual findings in the hospital. It's work, but it can be done. It would be somewhat more difficult to generalize it from one system to another. But at some point, if we're going to have these things out there, that's the kind of oversight that's going to be required. And it's going to take expertise, time, and money, which are three things that are always tough to find with the government.
Is there, just a final question before we move on, is there a possibility that their decisions at the FDA are being influenced by, the threat of litigation or the threat that they're going to come under some sort of scrutiny? Because I know that happens in other situations with, for example, with animal gene editing. There's farmers that say, hey, we want to raise cows that are immune to certain diseases. The technology exists to breed those animals, but the FDA says, no, we regulate those like new animal drugs. And so unless you go through this rigorous Byzantine review process, you cannot raise these animals. And a lot of experts have looked at that and they've said, well, that doesn't make any sense. You're putting these rules in place because you know that you're going to get sued by some activist group and they're going to bog you down in court. They're going to waste your budget and you're not going to get anything done as an agency. And so that's why you're doing it. In other words, are they afraid that Epic or some other company is going to try to sue them for hindering their business?
No, it's the litigation around algorithms is fascinating, and I've written about it several years ago, talking about autonomous cars and the litigation that is starting to develop from that. I'm going to return to the airplane. The airplanes are the most autonomous vehicles that we have created. Airplanes are fully capable of taking off, flying, and landing without anybody in the cockpit. That's the truth of the matter. The pilots are there to oversee the work of the algorithm. And when you look across the broad expanse of litigation involving aircraft autonomous systems, steering, GPS, the whole thing, there has never been a case where they have found against the algorithm manufacturer. In every case, litigation has found that the human is responsible. Either they didn't turn the system on or they did turn the system on. It's never the algorithm. It's always the human. And I think we're going to see the same kind of litigation around some of these health algorithms. It's not going to be Epic that's being held responsible. It's going to be the doctor who didn't see this or was misled by the algorithm. The algorithm itself is going to be considered blameless.
I think you're making the best argument I've ever heard for preventative medicine, Chuck. Stay out of the hospital because I don't even, you just might die because the stuff doesn't work the way it's supposed to. So eat well.
There you go. It's funny because I'll just say this. I was talking to a friend because I've had a few operations over the last year or two, and none of the operations, and these are operations that when I was training were considered major operations where you were in the hospital for 3 or 4 days. None of these procedures was I admitted to the hospital. They were all done as an outpatient, including the most recent one that was the proximate part of my clot. And we were just kidding around saying, what operation could possibly need to be done at this point where you'd have to stay in the hospital short of a heart transplant or heart surgery? Well, I discovered the answer. If you have a blood clot that takes up most of your lungs, you get to stay at the hospital. But that is no bargain. Just as a thought.
Yeah, it's crazy, man. I think, I don't know. I think there's a temptation to believe that modern medicine is this life-saving enterprise and it's done all kinds of great things, and therefore we can have trust that things work the way they're supposed to. And I think there's a lot of examples of that being the case, but it's not consistent as you've been talking about, So I think
there's no guarantee on that.
Right.
God loved medicine. It's life-saving. It saved my life. There's not a question in my mind about that. But sometimes it's a crapshoot.
Right. Well, speaking of things that the medical establishment gets wrong, Chuck, as we've discussed before, there's a lot of major medical institutions that are very bad on tobacco control and on electronic cigarettes as a substitute, a low risk substitute for smoking. And the Cleveland Clinic is the one I've most recently seen, and they published an article a couple weeks back called "How Vaping or Smoking Impacts Your Physical Activity," and it's a pretty innocuous title, but right away they get into this idea that vaping is not a safe alternative, and it has all of these very serious risks associated with it. So they open it by saying, contrary to some popular beliefs, vaping isn't a safe alternative to smoking. In fact, researchers say the rise of vaping threatens 5 decades of progress in the fight against tobacco use. So there's so much wrong with just that sentence. But I'm really curious to get your take as a physician here, because there's this weird sort of animosity or animus against vaping. And I don't know if it has to do with the fact that it allows people to enjoy the habit that they've developed without suffering as many consequences, or if they're just inherently skeptical of anything that's made by a tobacco company. I don't know what's going on, but whatever it is, it's driven them to make these really sort of absurd arguments against vaping. So one of the ones that I highlighted here is that on the one hand, they say nicotine is a toxic, addictive chemical. You need to do everything you can to avoid it. If you're addicted to it, you need to get off it as soon as possible. And then they turn around and they go, one of the best ways you can do that is to use this toxic, addictive chemical in the form of lozenges and gums and patches and inhalers. Right.
So you see that across you see this across the entire line of these medical addictions, that if you can find an opioid that doesn't have the high, that's an exit ramp from the problem. And I think that while nicotine doesn't necessarily give you a high, in air quotes, vaping is clearly safer than inhaling hot combustion products. Okay, I don't see how we can argue that point. My sense was in reading the whole article is that this phrase came to mind: perfection is the enemy of good. And the people that believe that there can be no tobacco on the planet believe that perfection is the only acceptable standard, and that doesn't take into account the wide range of our human behavior. As a physician, I would be happiest if you weren't using nicotine in any form. But if you're going to use nicotine, and I can't control that, I can only kind of nudge you a little in one direction or another, I would be far happier if you were vaping or chewing a nicotine lozenge than if you were inhaling. And perfection is the enemy of good. As a physician, I'll take good.
Well, especially in this case, because, and again, we're still learning about vaping as a smoking alternative. It's going to take years and years of research before we really conclusively understand anything about it. The way we do smoking, you can say with confidence, if you smoke your entire life, your risk of lung cancer goes up significantly. But you can't really say anything like that with vaping yet. I mean, you can look at people who get off cigarettes and you can say, well, their health improves markedly, but they've only been on the market for about 15 years. So
right. We don't have any kind of long-term.
Correct. So I mean, everything looks good at this point. And full disclosure, I've used an electronic cigarette for years now, and it's kept me off tobacco. It's great. And that's why I found this article so strange, is because I go to the gym 3 times a week. I lift heavy weights. I run sprints, and I do fine. And if I hadn't told my doctor that I use an electronic cigarette, she wouldn't know. There's nothing she could look at in my chart and go, oh yeah, this is, unless you tested me for some metabolite of nicotine or something, right? Then you would know. But in terms of looking at my health, there's nothing that would give it away. And so,
see, I'm surprised that you actually you confess to it. Because, well, you don't actually believe when the doctor says to the individual, do you drink alcohol? How many drinks do you have a day? That you get anywhere near the truth?
A couple glasses of wine, maybe. I don't know.
Oh no, because anything more than a glass and a half of wine, you're in the alcoholic range in terms of the criteria that are used. So,
It's only when the life insurance company comes sneaking around. That's when I don't know what nicotine is when. So anyways, I guess what I'm curious about is, it doesn't take much investigation to realize what's happening here. I mean, I cited a study where they followed a bunch of 40-year-old smokers who switched to electronic cigarettes, and even without trying, their habits improved, right? So they started to exercise a lot more and they started to eat better. So it's almost like they got rid of, most of the carcinogens that are in tobacco smoke, and they wanted to lead healthier lives.
Yes.
And Cleveland Clinic totally overlooked this study, and they said, well, when we look at rodents or whatever, and we see that they're, they have these heart palpitations when they take nicotine. And people, other experts have said, well, yeah, no, duh. I mean, any kind of stimulant, whether it's a scary movie or a cup of coffee, is going to elicit that sort of response. It doesn't mean that you're in poorer health or that you're less fit as a result of that. So I don't know. Do you have any insight there?
Well, again, I fall back on perfection is the enemy of good. And that's problematic. And I think the other thing is the Cleveland Clinic, while it touts itself as the first integrated international health system. But these are the same people that have brought alternative medicine to the fore and are pushing that forward, even though there's very little scientific data to support the idea that chanting will reduce your coronary risks or something along those lines.
Like chanting as in like some sort of some sort of shaman leads you through a spiritual...
Either that, I mean, there's some, if you go back in time to the stuff that was done by Dr. Ornish, the person behind the Ornish diet, he was able to show regressions of coronary artery plaque if you followed his diet, if you exercised as he indicated, and you meditated. You had to do all three. And nobody does all three. So, so it's tough to sell some of these holistic things when the holistic things also come with diet and exercise. It's not meditating by itself that will make you better. But sometimes, again, because the Cleveland Clinic is in the business of caring for people, they've expanded their horizons into integrative medicine because that sells. And once you're in the system, then maybe you can be convinced that those coronary arteries are not really responding to the supplements. A recent article showing that maybe it's time to have an angioplasty.
So the pretend stuff doesn't work. Well, let's try the real stuff and see if that...
And I'll tell you, so when I was a medical student, we had a bunch of electives, and one of the electives I went on was to spend a month at Cleveland Clinic because you could learn tremendous about cardiology while you were there, because they would list the people that were coming in for that day and the various murmurs that the people had. So for a medical student to hear heart murmurs and things like that, it was wonderful. But the thing that I found most interesting about the Cleveland Clinic is that its emergency room was about 400 square feet. It was not designed to take in emergency patients. Those patients that had emergencies, they were supposed to go 4 blocks down to Northwestern. That's where the emergency room. The only purpose of the emergency room at Cleveland Clinic was for people flying in from out of the country that needed to be admitted to roll through there. The Cleveland Clinic is a great hospital system, but it is not in its basic outlook designed to provide health care to the community.
That's interesting. So you think that might be influencing the sort of judgments they make about these?
Oh, absolutely. They are there to provide healthcare as a product, and this is one of the many ways that they can capture people into the system. It's no different than when you talk about Cleveland Clinic's outreach into Arizona and into Florida.
I got it. Okay. Yeah, and the reason I'm asking these sorts of questions is I'm just trying to peel back the incentive structure that might be in place. So, for example, and I don't know if this is true, but I would imagine there's some sort of financial benefit to selling these nicotine replacement therapies through your pharmacies, right? So if you're a hospital system, you can't, and it's like you can in England in some places, but here in the US, you can't say, here, I prescribe you one electronic cigarette for the next month. You can't do that, but you can say, hey, go to the pharmacy. We've got Nicorette in stock, 2 milligrams. Let's see if this can step you down from your cigarette habit, right? So,
right. Oh, I don't know that particular pharmaceutical has a big enough margin to drive the equation. But I think you've hit upon an important point, is that vaping in the United States is not considered a means of smoking reduction or cessation. And that means if you're pulling out a prescription pad as a physician, you can't write it. And that actually is an important point. It's not, if you're not going to get the gravitas from the medical community for vaping that you can get for nicotine lozenges and nicotine patches, because vaping has not been approved for smoking cessation as it has in other countries.
Yeah, it's a strange discussion that's going on around this. I'm curious to see how it evolves over time, but there you have it. If you want to vape, Cleveland Clinic is not a fan. Okay. Well, we're gonna leave it there for the week. Thank you all for joining us as always. If you want to get these stories in your inbox that we talk about, just go to our website, acsh.org. And then there's a subscribe button at the top. You click on that, punch in your email address, and then 3 times a week, we send you these stories. So when you show up for the podcast and we start talking about the articles you've read the most, you go, hey, I know what that article is because I read it. And you might get a little bit more out of the show if you do that. So check it out. Follow us on Twitter as well. We're at ACSH.org, and you can find all our stuff on Twitter because we post it and we argue with people that don't like us and we answer questions. So if you want to talk to us, we're on Twitter. We will be back next week, episode 27. We've done 26 of these now. I'm impressed with us, Chuck. So pat ourselves on the back, and we will see you next time.
Excellent. Take care.